As World War II tore the world apart, the people who fought its battles faced challenges that those who never experienced it could never imagine. While the war raged, millions of people were beaten, tortured, slaughtered, and imprisoned. Never in human history had there been a war with so much bloodshed and heartbreak. With the entire world thrown into war and countless battles being fought simultaneously, millions of people found themselves as prisoners of war, or POWs. For many, being captured was not the end of the war, for so many of these people had to cling onto existence itself with every ounce of willpower they could muster, as they prayed and hoped the war would come to an end, and hopefully with it, the end of their long and painful captivity. In this video, we're going to look at the conditions that POWs would be faced with throughout the war. Conditions varied a great deal between which country was holding their prisoners and what nationalities or ethnicities the prisoners were. To get a better picture of what one could expect as a POW, I will look into the United States and Germany and how these nations treated their prisoners. For the United States, the housing of prisoners of war was one of their immediate endeavors upon entering the war. The United Kingdom had been fighting the Germans for over 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The small island nation had been collecting German POWs for years, and they were running critically low on housing for their prisoners. Once the United States and Germany officially declared war on each other on December 11, 1941, the British government requested the United States to accept 175,000 prisoners of war. The United States accepted these German POWs and immediately began constructing camps to house them. In World War II, the United States would ship over 30,000 prisoners of war every month from the battlefield to the United States. It is important to remember that the United States of late 1941 and early 1942 was a very different United States than the one that exists today. The United States was largely an isolationist nation who did not want to participate in any European war, especially after the experiences of World War I. This was not the global superpower that we all know today. The United States was unsure how to even hold large amounts of POWs, as they had very little experience with them. The United States government had very little preparation in terms of logistics to house so many prisoners, and they feared that the POWs would cause widespread fear and pose a national security problem. Despite their concerns, the U.S. quickly got to work constructing over 700 POW camps spread out across the country. The government established guidelines on where these camps should be constructed and how the prisoners should be treated. The camps were to be constructed in mild climates in the country and far away from urban or industrial locations to minimize the security risks that come with having hundreds of thousands of individuals who belong to a nation that is at war with the United States. According to the international laws regarding the treatment of POWs that were established by the Geneva Convention, the United States was permitted to use POWs as labor, but only if the prisoners were compensated for their work. The United States government took full advantage of this by placing a majority of the camps in areas that they believed would struggle to maintain food production across the southern and southwestern parts of the United States. With this, the United States had a plan. They would ship hundreds of thousands of POWs to the southern United States and have them work on farms to help bolster the American food supply. But how did this plan affect the lives of the prisoners who were forced to live in these camps? As the war grew more brutal throughout the war, a German soldier would often find themselves relieved to know they had been captured by the Americans and not another member of the Allied powers. As they boarded American Liberty ships, the treatment they would receive would often surprise them, as they were fed large meals on the ships headed to their prison camp in the United States. Remember, the Germans, especially later in the war, suffered from food shortages. Late in the war, the German soldier had become used to seeing and hearing about their cities being bombed into oblivion, and hearing how much their people were sacrificing to continue the war. When these German soldiers arrived in America, they were stunned to see how different America was compared to their fatherland. They had been fighting America as best they could throughout the war, and when these soldiers arrived in the United States, it had to be disheartening to see how well the Americans were living. They were not only surviving, America was prospering through the war. When they arrived at their camps, they were separated by their rank and placed into their housing. The housing they received in America was similar to the housing that the American military members received. The enlisted German soldiers were allowed 40 square feet of living space, while the officers were granted 120 square feet. Generals and admirals were given bungalows with their own private gardens. One German prisoner of war named Gunther Grahl commented on his treatment in his prison camp in Washington with, quote, "It was in August or September 1944 when I stood in front of a shop in the POW camp at Fort Lewis considering what to buy first. An ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I was able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola, never before. So I decided to take both. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." End quote. The German soldiers would be forced to work in agricultural production, but would be paid for their work. The Germans were then allowed to use their money to buy goods they normally would never have access to in Germany. After their work was done, the Germans were offered a variety of entertainment options, including live performances, board games, sports, and even educational classes. Despite the United States having well over 450,000 Axis prisoners, less than 1% of these ever bothered attempting to escape. Some German prisoners were allowed outside of the prisons without guards on the basis of an honor system. These prisoners were even allowed to eat in restaurants that black Americans were forbidden to eat at due to Jim Crow laws. Overall, the Americans, as well as the British, treated their POWs better than any other great power in World War II. As we saw in my last video, during World War II, German prisoners of war of the United States and Britain were treated remarkably well. Germany's treatment of prisoners of war is an entirely different story. Germany is an interesting country to examine because their treatment of POWs varies so widely depending on who the POWs were. Germany signed the Geneva Convention in 1929. In accordance with the convention, Germany in most cases treated American and British POWs as best they could. However, I want to begin looking at French POWs in Germany. Germany launched their invasion of France on May 10, 1940. The invasion was massive. The Germans gathered 3.3 million men, 2,400 tanks, and 5,638 aircraft, and they poured them into neutral Belgium on their way to France. The French were quickly overwhelmed and found themselves fighting for survival. In 1 month, the French army had suffered 100,000 deaths, and their government was in talks to surrender. On June 25, 1940, 1 month and 2 weeks after the invasion had begun, France fell and signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. For France itself, the country was split in half. The northern half was directly occupied by the German army. This area would become the occupied zone. Meanwhile, the southern half of France would be ruled by a puppet government of the Germans. This area would be called Vichy France. Vichy France was ruled by French General Philippe Pétain. In the war, Germany managed to capture 1.8 million French soldiers, or 10% of the total male population of France, and held them as prisoners of war. The Germans told them that their war was over, but in reality they would experience 5 years of imprisonment, away from their families as their loved ones lived under the tyranny of Nazi rule. Before we look into the lives of French POWs, I think it is important to look at how their imprisonment affected the lives of their families. While their husbands and sons were held in captivity in Germany, the families of the POWs suffered a great deal from their absence. In France, men were the main income earners in families. With 10% of the male population gone, women were forced into roles they were not accustomed to. They started their own businesses and farms, and many had to look for employment. In Vichy France, the government, now ruled by the authoritarian Philippe Pétain, began what they called a moral rejuvenation of France. The government became obsessed with family values and worried about infidelity among the wives of POWs and tried to dissuade women from joining the workforce. This made life even more difficult for the wives of POWs. Their income plummeted and their standards of living drastically fell. As everyone struggled with either occupation or living under a new authoritarian and collaborative regime, the families of nearly 2 million prisoners of war suffered even more. To dissuade infidelity, Pétain's government made abortion an offense punishable by death. One woman was guillotined for administering an abortion. She became the last woman in French history to be guillotined. For women who did have affairs, they were treated as no more than prostitutes in their communities. The French prisoners were initially held in camps located in France itself. But after many escapes, the Germans decided to relocate their French prisoners to Germany itself. The treatment that these POWs experienced was largely based on their ethnicity. Around 120,000 of these POWs were from French colonial possessions in Africa. As most of these soldiers were black, they were often faced with horrible conditions in German prison camps. During the battle for France, the Germans lined up and shot an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 black French soldiers, rather than take them as prisoners. The Nazis were hesitant to allow any black prisoners onto German territory, out of fear that supposed German racial purity might be compromised. Instead, the Germans kept them in prisons spread across France, and often used them as human test subjects for medical and anthropological experiments. Throughout the war, Germany allowed a small trickle of POWs to return home in exchange for certain actions by Vichy France. It quickly became obvious that Germany was holding on to the POWs as hostages to ensure that the French continued to cooperate with the German conquerors. The POWs who did get to return early were treated horribly by the French. The French were very suspicious of these POWs. The French believed they were being sent back as collaborators and were often viewed as traitors. For the prisoners who were forced to live as prisoners until the German defeat, the biggest issue they would face was starvation. As Germany began to lose the war, feeding prisoners became a lower priority. This resulted in widespread starvation and disease. The camps that these prisoners inhabited were squalid, and many of these soldiers died due to their poor conditions. When Germany was finally defeated on May 7, 1945, the French prisoners who had been trying to survive their long captivity finally got to return home. Most of these prisoners had very little, if any, contact with their loved ones. Most of these prisoners had no idea if their families even survived the Nazi occupation. But as they made their way home, they were disappointed to discover that they were never welcomed back as heroes, but were met with disdain by their countrymen. The French viewed these returning POWs as cowards, and blamed them for allowing France to fall into the brutal hands of the Nazis. In Part 3 of the treatment of World War II POWs, we are going to take a look at Soviet prisoners of Nazi Germany. While the French experienced many horrors while under German captivity, they had it comparatively easy compared to Soviet prisoners in Germany. The treatment of Soviet prisoners stemmed from Nazi ideology. The Nazis hated communism and Slavic people. This combination meant that the Soviet Union was Nazi Germany's sworn enemy. After the fall of France and the failure of the Luftwaffe's attack on Great Britain, Adolf Hitler decided it was time to rid the world of the Soviet Union. To prepare for their invasion, the Nazi High Command laid out their plan in what was known as General Plan Ost, or Master Plan for the East. These plans laid out how Germany was to exterminate the population of Russia and Eastern Europe. They would, in their words, liquidate any Jews, Slavs, communists, or any others the Nazis determined to be Untermenschen, or undesirables. The people that the Germans decided to not murder would be used as slave labor to serve the Germans in any way they saw fit. With the population either enslaved or dead, the Germans planned to move German families into the former Soviet Union to colonize it. Hitler told his generals that the coming war with the Soviet Union was to be a war for existence, and that the Soviets were to be annihilated. With occupation plans in place, the Germans began amassing the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. On June 22, 1941, 3.8 million Axis soldiers poured over the Soviet Union's border on a front that was nearly 2,000 miles long. The Germans' massive invasion caught the Soviets unprepared, and the results were horrifying for the Russians. Within the first week, over 600,000 Russians were either dead, wounded, or captured. Over the course of the next 5 months, the Soviets would see almost 1 million soldiers killed and 6 million either wounded or captured. With millions of Soviets being captured, it is important to remember that in many situations, especially in 1941, the Germans simply shot any Soviet who tried to surrender. With the Eastern Front being such a brutal war of hatred, being one of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers that were captured by the Germans was a deadly nightmare. While the French had a miserable existence in German captivity, the Germans largely stuck to the Geneva Convention when dealing with American and British and other Allied prisoners of war. Many American prisoners commented after their imprisonment that the Germans treated them as best they could with the resources they had. For the Soviets, this was a completely different picture. By the end of 1941, the first year of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans had captured millions of Soviet soldiers, and 2/3 of them would die in prisoner of war camps. The Germans would watch as they slowly starved the Soviet prisoners to death, or let them die from exposure in brutal winters. By early 1942, the deaths of so many Soviet prisoners of war by the Germans would already rank as one of the highest death rates among mass atrocities in history. Soviet Jews, women combatants, political commissars, many officers, intellectuals, communists, and Asians were systematically executed by the Germans upon capture on the front lines. In most cases, wounded or sick Soviet soldiers who were captured were simply shot on the spot. Out of the survivors, over 1 million were forcibly marched to Germany to serve as slave labor. These Soviet slaves would be worked to death, while in many cases the local German population simply watched as the Soviet prisoners collapsed from starvation or exhaustion. Over 100,000 Soviet POWs were transported to Nazi concentration camps, rather than any prisoner of war camps. In many cases, these prisoners were treated worse than most of their victims. As Russians were captured on the front lines, Germany refused to allow the prisoners to use train cars out of fear of disease. The result was that millions of Soviets were marched in death marches across hundreds of miles with very little food or water. If a soldier fell behind, they were simply shot. In the winter, the Germans would pack many Russians in open cattle wagons, where nearly 200 to 250,000 Russians would freeze to death before ever making it to their destination. German prison camps for captured Soviet soldiers were horrid. They often had no buildings and no latrines. The prisoners were simply packed into four-wired fences to serve as walls and left in the elements. Many of these camps had no running water and rudimentary kitchens. In the winter, many soldiers tried digging holes to get out of the wind. In one of the largest camps, 30 to 40,000 Soviets would die in captivity. Forcibly starving these prisoners was a common practice by the Germans. Starving Soviets would eat anything they could get their hands on: worms, bark, leaves, clothing. Many of these soldiers were in so much suffering that they wrote handwritten notes to their guards begging to be shot. Some Soviets even resorted to cannibalism to survive, a crime the Germans would shoot Soviets for. In the end, 2.8 to 3.3 million Soviet POWs would die. Life as a POW in World War II was hard, no matter what country you were a prisoner of. Being confined to a prison camp while your families were left wondering about your safety and not being able to see your loved ones until the war ended is enough to make life as a POW a living nightmare. However, the country holding the soldier as a POW and the ethnic background of the individual soldier mattered a lot to the quality of life that soldier could expect to live. For Axis POWs in America, life was relatively good in terms of prison camps and treatment. For American POWs in Germany, it was much the same, except with less food. However, due to the racist and hateful ideology of the Nazis, treatment for POWs could and often were horrific. When World War II came to an end, with the Axis powers left in ruins, the POWs that survived would return home. Many were welcomed as heroes, while many were also shunned and disgraced, but they should never be forgotten. In a continuation of our series on POW and internment camps in World War II, we are going to look at an often overlooked but tragic decision that the United States made in the war: the internment of Japanese American civilians across the country.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And what would become known as a day that would live in infamy, 2,403 Americans would be killed in the surprise attack. As the nation reeled, Americans were desperate for revenge and justice. A wave of anti-Japanese attitudes swept the country, and the 120,000 people living in the U.S. with Japanese ancestry quickly found themselves surrounded by a nation who resented them. Meanwhile, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration grew suspicious of potential spies and saboteurs inside American borders. These attitudes and fears continued to grow as Imperial Japan found victory on the battlefield. By 1941, the Japanese had been fighting for 4 years in their massive war against the Chinese and other Asian nations. Their military was battle-hardened and extremely effective. Their expansion into the Philippines and victories in Guam and Malaya further strengthened anti-Japanese sentiments across the United States. This new powerful enemy was deeply hated by the Americans, and the innocent Japanese Americans would soon suffer the hate of the nation. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. On the basis of preventing threats to national security, the executive order allowed the military to establish, quote, military areas. Sadly, this executive order led to the military forcibly relocating nearly every single individual with Japanese ancestry in the United States mainland. The government hoped to use these individuals as farm labor, but states in the interior of the country were highly resistant to having Japanese Americans move onto their land. Anti-Japanese racism was extremely prevalent across the country, and many states were afraid that an increase in Japanese Americans would lead to violence. With no states accepting Japanese Americans, the federal government decided to construct relocation centers across the country. At first, the government tried requesting that the Japanese people voluntarily go to these centers. Obviously, that was not something that they wanted to do, so the government made it mandatory. Japanese families had only a few days to move their families to temporary assembly centers. They were forced to leave their homes, their friends, their jobs, and almost all of their possessions. Many would lose their homes forever. The beginning of this massive nationwide relocation program resulted in the complete upheaval of all of the Japanese lives. As these families began to appear at the temporary assembly centers, they were appalled by their conditions. Many of these centers were quickly built, and the living conditions were horrible. Some centers were built into horse racing tracks, and whole families would be forced to live in an empty horse stall with nothing but dirt floors. While the families made the best of their new terrible living facilities, the government's War Relocation Authority rushed to build 10 more permanent relocation facilities around the country. These relocation facilities looked exactly like what you would imagine POW camps to look like. They were built in an army barrack style and were surrounded by a massive fence with barbed wire on top. There were guard towers surrounding the camp to prevent any Japanese person from escaping. Most of these camps were built in the western part of the United States. During the summer, the heat was unbearable, and the barracks were cramped with multiple families sharing one building. During the winter, it was freezing, and the cheaply built facilities did little to protect them from the elements. Remember, as we discussed the conditions of these camps, these people were innocent. They had committed no crime, and many of them were American citizens being treated like enemies of the state. They were locked up simply because of their race. Life in the camps were miserable, but the Japanese people tried their best to make it work. They began turning the camps into functioning towns, trying their best to forget the barbed wire and guard towers keeping them imprisoned. They built schools, fire departments, police forces, newspapers. They had proms, yearbooks, markets, sports, clubs, and even churches. Despite their current situation, they built a life in these camps, and they functioned as little towns. The Japanese people would spend almost 3 years locked away in these camps. What is really remarkable about these people is that despite their nation hating them and their freedom being stripped from them, many would volunteer to fight for the U.S. and were shipped to Europe to fight the Nazis. In 1943, the U.S. government approached the Japanese internment camps and began administering so-called loyalty tests. The government asked every Japanese American in the camps 2 questions. Would they reject allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, and would they be willing to serve in the U.S. military? This test infuriated many Japanese Americans, who were enraged as being treated as enemies of the state, despite their citizenship status, and had never shown loyalty to the Emperor of Japan in the first place. In protest, many Japanese Americans simply responded no to both questions. These Americans would be taken from their families and shipped to another camp intended to house disloyal Japanese Americans. However, many Japanese said yes to both and were enlisted in the U.S. Army. By the end of the war, 33,000 Japanese men and women volunteered to aid in the U.S. military in their war against Germany. 20,000 Japanese men would directly fight in the U.S. Army. Many of these Japanese men would go on to be decorated war heroes that proved excellent in combat. For example, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was a segregated Japanese American unit that today is remembered as the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. This one unit collected over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 560 Silver Star medals, and 21 Medals of Honor and 7 Presidential Unit citations. Despite most of these soldiers having their entire family locked in an American internment camp, they fought hard to prove their allegiance to their country and to defeat the Nazis. This is one reason why their motto would be, quote, going for broke. The internment of Japanese civilians ended on December 17, 1944. As the Japanese returned home, they often found their homes sold, their businesses gone, their jobs lost, and their lives changed forever. Further challenges like alien land laws in California, Oregon, and Washington prevented many Japanese people from owning their pre-war homes and farms. In all, the Japanese civilians lost over $400 million worth of property during their imprisonment. In 1948, Congress provided $38 million in reparations, and 40 years later paid an additional $20,000 to every Japanese internment victim that still lived. On December 7, 1991, the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, President George H.W. Bush said, quote, "In remembering, it is important to come to grips with the past. No nation can fully understand itself or find its place in the world if it does not look with clear eyes at all the glories and disgraces of its past. We in the United States acknowledge such an injustice in our history. The internment of Americans of Japanese ancestry was a great injustice, and it will never be repeated."